If, like me, you enjoy hurting yourself on a deeply emotional level, you like to look at the prices of graphics cards on eBay. 2021 is not a good time to be shopping for GPU upgrades, and you might instead like to know how older models perform in modern titles. In this episode of Tales from the Scalper Pandemic, I'm looking at some of my favourite cards from the last decade, the Radeon 200 series. The AMD Radeon R9 280 was released in 2014, but it's essentially a rebadge of the older Radeon HD 7970. Like most Radeon cards of this era, it's based on the GCN architecture that AMD used in their GPUs for the 8th gen consoles, so it still remains reasonably relevant even today. Compared to the R9 270X we saw in the last video, we have a larger GPU with 512 more shader units and 50% more VRAM, so we should hope to see somewhat better performance. As a result, if you're building a system around this card, maybe look for a slightly better PSU, maybe 600 watts, and with both 6 and 8 pin PCI Express connectors. I picked this particular model up from a UK used tech retailer for just £40 in December 2020, which was a ridiculously good deal and might be tough to emulate, but I would certainly expect to pay less than £100 for one today. This version is a Gigabyte Windforce model with a hefty triple fan cooler and that oh so dated shiny plastic shroud, but I have high hopes for this card. Before we see how it performs, let's have a quick review of the test PC. Although it makes sense to use a high-performance CPU to remove that from the list of variables on game performance, in this context I used a Ryzen 3 3100. This entry-level quad-core CPU is representative of the kind of performance I suspect the majority of PC gamers will have access to. Anyone with a quad-core Intel i5 or i7, or AMD Ryzen from the last few years, shouldn't be CPU limited when using this card. With that out of the way, starting off with the newest title on the list, Valheim is a survival game in the same mould as Rust and Ark. Don't let the decidedly retro aesthetic fool you, this is a pretty demanding game. Set to 1080 and medium quality, we get an average of 42 FPS with 1% lows of 28. Though, as this early access game is still under development, it may be that future updates affect performance one way or another. Horizon Zero Dawn was, until recently, exclusive to the PlayStation 4, a console whose graphics performance is technically lower than that of the R9 280, though which has access to more VRAM. As such, I thought I'd try to match PS4 visuals using the original quality preset, but had to settle for a resolution of 720. As a result of that lack of VRAM, I still couldn't hit the constant 30 FPS mark that the console manages, instead seeing an average of 36, but with 1% lows down to 26. Call of Duty Warzone at 720 low settings falls ever so slightly short of being a perfectly smooth experience, with an almost nice average FPS of 68, but 1% lows down to 47. This is about 20 to 25% better than the R9 270X I looked at in another video, and I think it just about qualifies as playable. Fortnite at competitive settings is a joy on the R9 280, averaging 110 FPS and dropping only as far as 75 at the low end. That's high enough that you could consider using V-Sync on a conventional 60 or 75Hz display to obtain a perfectly smooth experience, but not really high enough to start turning up the quality settings without risking the odd stutter. If you watched my last video, I dropped a hint that I didn't see much of a performance gain in higher end graphics cards when testing in Valorant deathmatches. In the case of the R9 280, the average rises to 185 and the 1% lows hit 120, less than 10% higher than the cheaper, lower power drain card. There's a slightly more measurable benefit in Rocket League moving up from the 270X, with a rise from 100 FPS to 115 average, and minimums climbing from 36 to 44. Whether this is at any point noticeable is debatable. I was running these tests on a 60Hz TV rather than my 144Hz monitor, and I couldn't point out any particular benefits at all. Your mileage, however, may vary. The Medium is a horror game that, for better or worse, pays homage to old-school PS1 titles like Resident Evil and Silent Hill, but with a cutting-edge engine that requires a considerable amount of horsepower. Designed for AMD's RDNA architecture, the aging GCN 1.0 of this card starts out well enough in some indoor scenes, but the busier and more demanding outdoors, and in particular the sequences that involve a split-screen effect, send the FPS plummeting. The average hit just 24 FPS and lows of only 12. Cyberpunk has earned its reputation as the crisis of the 2020s, and this old R9 280 isn't enough to keep up with it. In fact, the frame rate at 720 with the low preset is pretty much the same as the 270X, though of course this is possibly down to different traffic or weather in game. It's still fair to say that you're only likely going to see averages of about 35 FPS here. Running at a resolution of 1080 and low quality settings, Doom Eternal fits quite nicely with the R9 280, scoring an average of 69 and 1% lows of 48. If you simply must have 60 FPS in your FPSs, I think it's reasonable to think a drop in resolution to 900 or 720 should tip your minimums just over the edge. Just as Forza Horizon 4 is almost enough to convince casual observers that Britain is anything but a dingy backwater with an overinflated national ego, the R9 280 is almost enough to play the game at a smooth frame rate with medium settings. Averages just beat 50 FPS, and 1% lows are about 40. That's a nice 20% increase from the 270X, but still a little short of the magic 60. Finally, I neglected to mention in the previous video that I did a time spy run to help keep score between graphics cards. The R9 270X scored 1777, whereas this R9 280 managed 2095, or about 18% higher. Factoring in the still insufficient 3GB of VRAM and overall modest performance, the R9 280 falls a little short of the needs of AAA games going into 2021. If you already own one of these cards, or the many variations on the same chip, it can still keep up with less demanding games and can act as a stopgap on games like Cyberpunk until something better comes along. But if you're in the market for a budget GPU in 2021, I can't help but think there are better choices out there. One of which I may or may not be featuring in my next video. Keep an eye out for the last of my Radeon 200 series videos next week. Kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.